Meeting people and holding conversations can seem intimidating. And I used to dread the idea of small talk, let alone the idea of approaching somebody and holding a conversation. So I worked on becoming a more outgoing person. I read books on the subject, I went out of my way to talk to random people, and eventually, I became the person that I am today. Hi, I'm Michael, I'm a student at Brown University, and today I want to share some of the tips as to how I went through that transformation. These tips are inspired by Dale Carnegie's famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. The book goes over how to make meeting people more interesting, but also how to make holding conversations a more enjoyable process. I have 6 tips to share today about how to become a more outgoing and sociable person and hold better conversations. The first tip is summed up shortly. To be interesting, be interested. In other words, how would you like it if you met somebody for the first time and during an entire conversation, they only talked about themselves and never asked one question about you? You wouldn't like it very much. So the key is to shift your energy. Rather than spewing your energy outward and only talking about yourself, it is important to reverse your energy in a sense and become more actively interested in what the other person has experienced in their life. It's important to reiterate to not be ingenuine when you're trying to learn about somebody. People love to share their experiences and advice with others. So it's important to understand that a shift in your perspective will let you become a much more interesting person by doing much less work. In other words, by simply trying to learn about an individual through the perspectives that they have lived, I find that holding conversations and meeting people becomes a much more interesting and enjoyable process. For example, you have obviously lived your life, but what about living the life of somebody who has lived in a foreign country or somebody who has grown up in a different situation than you? Learning about all these different opportunities and perspectives helps you to become a more knowledgeable individual as well. You also become more empathetic. So taking an active role and being genuinely interested in somebody else's life not only makes you a more interesting person to them because you are showing an active interest in their life and experiences, but you also become more knowledgeable. So it's a win-win situation in the whole sense. Again, genuine interest is the key. The second tip, smile. Smiling is key as an indicator into how approachable somebody is. So if you're trying to become a more approachable person, it's important to show that you can smile and that you're not angry or frustrated in the moment. Because when we see somebody with a non-smiling face, it is simply an indicator that something may be wrong or that they may be angry or upset. Oftentimes, even though this isn't the case, we don't want to take the risk of approaching somebody with that idea in mind. So it's important to not only smile about being grateful for the things you have in your life in a general sense, but also smiling actively during a conversation and actively showing your emotions when a person is speaking or talking about their life will make you become a much more interesting person to have a conversation with. The third tip I would give is to say their name. So when you're introduced to somebody, not only to remember their name, but also to say their name back to them when you say their first sentence after, such as "Nice to meet you, Dan." This also works to make sure that you remember their name as well. Of course, although people love to hear their name, it's important to not overdo this. So don't be the person to start saying somebody's name every time you start or end the sentence, because then it becomes very repetitive and it's going to be seen as very awkward in the conversation. But trying to sprinkle in somebody's name or just being sure to say their name when there's an opportunity will work miles toward making you a better conversationalist. The fourth tip is stop talking and start listening. In other words, encourage people to talk about themselves. Again, this sort of idea that you're shifting your energy such that you become more attractive by actively inquiring about the life of another person. Also, as a general psychology tip, sharing too much about yourself or oversharing to another person will only make the other person dislike you more. A fun habit I learned to encourage people to talk more about themselves is to simply mirror exactly what they say or the last word or phrase of what they said back to them in an inquisitive tone. So if somebody just said that they ran a marathon, you can say, "A marathon?" back to them, and naturally will like to continue and give more details about the situation because the other person is actively asking about that situation. Mirroring as a conversational tool works better with some individuals over others. For example, if somebody is more of a listener, then of course they're not going to want to continue to talk about themselves for the entirety of the time you talk to them, but just trying to use this as a habit or trying to actively ask a question such as, "Where did you run the marathon?" for example, could be a tool that is used to inquire more about a person in a way that shows your genuine interest going back to the first point. And then of course, if you're going to inquire about a person, do not ask questions that end with yes or no. In general, these are dead ends, and trying to be more inquisitive and ask who, what, where, when, why questions even are more effective in terms of continuing a conversation and making you more actively engage in what the person has to say. It also allows the other person to talk more and give more detail about a conversation naturally. The fifth tip is to talk in terms of the other person's interests. There's a story that Dale Carnegie wrote about in which an uncle was visiting his nephew for the first time. This nephew, although he was only 4 years old, loved sailing, and the uncle asked the father what the son liked to do. And since the father knew that his son loved to play with boats and loved sailing, he told the uncle all about that. The uncle, in an effort to engage with the nephew, learned about sailing and boats, and that was the first thing he brought up after introducing himself to the nephew. And when he left, the nephew talked to his father all day about how much he loved his uncle and how interesting of a person he was, when in fact all the uncle did was simply learn a few things about sailing and boats and discussed it with the nephew. So from the story, it's clear to see that people love certain subjects. Obviously, we have certain hobbies that pique more to our interest than others. So if you're speaking with an individual and you're trying to learn about them, or you're trying to be a good conversationalist, you can try to do, for example, some research on what they like to do as a hobby. For example, look on social media and see if they like to do a certain activity. If they like to play music, you can ask them about whatever instrument they play and how they got into it. Or you can talk about their career and what led them to that opportunity. If you're trying to be a good conversationalist, it's important to ask other people about the stuff they're interested in, because that is something that they have a breadth of knowledge about. And people will like you more if they see you as more similar to them. If you try to relate to their hobbies, people will see you as more similar to them and will inherently like you more. The final tip is to acknowledge something positive about the other person. With this tip, it's of course important to be genuine if you're going to compliment somebody, but also it's important to not complain, criticize, or condemn another person when they're trying to describe something to you. So if you're talking with somebody and they talk about their accomplishments, you can compliment them on their effort or their hard work, or you can compliment them on a trait that is obvious from their description of the story. It's important to be sincere in your compliments and to not hand out compliments to something that you don't like, for example, just to make the conversation go quicker or to an effort to be a better conversationalist. In general, it's important to try to see something positive in the other person, because inherently they'll like talking to you more if you're going to acknowledge the positives of what they do. In conclusion, I must reiterate that all of these tips to be a better conversationalist are coming from a genuine standpoint. I find that I personally apply these in my life, that this personal shift in mindset from trying to talk about myself to being interested in somebody and what they have to say about themselves has made conversations much more interesting, and has made it much more interesting for the other person, of course, because they get to talk about their experiences in life. In a conversation, of course, you could balance more toward 50-50, and that's the ideal amount, but it's important not to steer on the ends of letting another person talk for the entirety of a situation versus you talking for the entirety of the situation as well. So use these tips to genuinely become more interested in a person and to just show your gratitude to be having a conversation with that person in general. It's important to show other people how grateful we are to be friends with them or to be even holding a conversation with them. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.